Chinkin. I am Elvira Dominguez Redondo. And yeah, we met, what, 10 minutes ago for the first time, so this is going to be a joint, unrehearsed sort of double act on essentially women's human rights and issues relating to rights for sexual minorities, transgender, gender identity, LGBT, in the jargon. So, do you want to start, as we suggested?
Yeah. So, thank you very much for coming.
Yes, yeah.
And apologies, we are a bit late, and it's all my fault. In any case, today's session is going to be shared by Professor Chinkin and I.
It's the door downstairs.
I thought it was the computer or something.
Right, okay, fine.
And the idea of it is to portray how women's issues and gender issues, sexual orientation, gender identity have become a big part of the United Nations agenda internationally, and Professor Chinkin will be dealing more with women's rights, while I'm going to try to focus on how a topic that has been a taboo in the United Nations and at every other intergovernmental body, sexual orientation, the part of sexuality that was not only related to discrimination and reproductive rights at some point, has become also a big part of the agenda, and what were the factors allowing it to happen, and as I think you will see also, the contingency, the lucky factor that allows these things to happen at some point also means, and Professor Chinkin was saying that before, that it might be reversed at some point, and not, the rights are not completely earned ever. When I was a student, as some of the students of mine that I see here, I remember I read this beautiful book by Pedro Niquel. He's a Venezuelan human rights lawyer. I think he's still alive, but I'm not sure. And it was, the whole book was about the irreversibility of human rights. And it was a full book about how you cannot reverse human rights, because if you are given rights because they are part of your dignity, it's impossible to go back from it. But unfortunately, we are witnessing other times.
Like I say, I'd add on to that. I mean, there's this great image of a sort of linear progression, you know, that things are getting better constantly. We're moving forward. It's a whole sort of enlightenment and subsequently type view. And yeah, as you say, that once we've made such progress, we can't go backwards. This area, I think that is a very, very risky assumption. I mean, I'll talk more about the sort of narrative of women's human rights in just a moment, but sort of now spanning quite a long career, it seems to me that we have gone through a stage of really thinking triumphalism. Yeah, we had got it, we had really got some really good language and so on. 1995, the Beijing Women's Conference was probably this sort of high spot moment, and ever since then it's been a very contested, very confrontational, just to hang on to the language that we got at that time. And for example, last year, well, sorry, 2 years ago now, since we're in January, 2012 Commission of the Status of Women meeting actually dissolved without any document being adopted by the Commission, precisely because it was the overall fear was that any document would be so much weaker than what we had already. It was better to avoid having anything. So I think that sort of we're looking at women's rights, LGBT rights general. I think sort of just they're a continuous narrative, and that's really, I think, what we want to get at. How these things came about, why nobody ever thought of them before, why when they did think about them, they were contested and confrontational, and who was it that got it there? And essentially what we're talking about here is a story about civil society, NGOs, bodies that have been taking on deeply entrenched and prejudiced views of states that were unwilling for various reasons, and also in some very strange alliances, There aren't many areas where you get the US and Iran completely in alignment with each other. Come to this area and, you know, guess what? There they are, both of them resisting various forms of reform. So anyway, that's our sort of overall. So shall I start on the women's human rights story? And because we're starting with the women's human rights story, because this was really the first sort of inroad, if you like, into identifying, perhaps a second, race maybe first, but we'll come back to that, but race and women as identifying collectivities, groups, however one wants to identify, as a group suffering particular forms of violations of human rights that needed to be looked at specifically. So we're talking about specificity as opposed to the far more general universality type language of the Universal Declaration and the 2 UN covenants. Now, straight away, you're probably identifying the major problem that we'll come back to, which is what is a woman? And what are the multiple identities that coexist alongside being a woman or a man? Identities relating to race, ethnicity, sexuality, disability, age, etc., etc. So there's a problem right from the word go about this very notion of women's rights in some way. Again, we'll come back to that. But to do the chronological story, 1945, you know, modern international law, UN Charter, etc., is the first international legal instrument that contains any reference at all to what we now call identity politics, and essentially as a major purpose of the UN is the protection of human rights, including non-discrimination on the basis of, and you get that long catalogue, which includes sex. In 1945, the word gender doesn't exist. In many languages it still doesn't exist, but it certainly didn't in 1945. So what they are talking about there is non-discrimination as between women as a sort of essentialised sort of type notion, and men equally as an essentialised type notion. This gets picked up in the Universal Declaration, 1948. So we have another non-discrimination clause, followed in the 2 1966 covenants, ICCPR, and economic, social, and cultural rights. All of them just replicate this basic notion of non-discrimination on the basis of sex, i.e. an assumption of equality. Yeah, and an assumption that if people are treated equally, then they will have equal enjoyment of their human rights. Okay, just a sort of flash over institutionally at this point. I presume you all looked at the creation of what was the Commission on Human Rights, now the Human Rights Council, as the Commission of the Economic Social Council, which has the functional responsibility for dealing with human rights within the UN framework. Back in 1945, the Sub-Commission on the Status of Women was created as a sub-commission of the Commission on Human Rights. And that instantly, the women who were there at 1945 took the view that if they were going to be a sub-commission of the Commission of Human Rights, they would never be able to set their own agenda. They would always be subservient to other priorities with respect to human rights. So at the very first meeting, they essentially led a revolt and got themselves established as a separate commission. So from 1946 onwards, we have General Assembly, ECOSOC, Commission on Human Rights, Commission on the Status of Women. Commission on the Status of Women at this point essentially is working on identifying particular areas with respect to subordination of women that they felt needed to be identified and corrected. So they drafted and got adopted a treaty, for example, on minimum age of marriage, a treaty on political rights of women, essentially about vote and right to political participation. So very specific issues, very particular treaties, not widely ratified, and otherwise primarily worked on development. Women's issues were primarily seen as development, and we have a whole separate story about women and development, which at different points merges with the human rights story. But given we've only got 2 hours, I think we better leave a little development story to one side. Okay, so we've got CSW, we've got these various corrective treaties, we've got a general prohibition of discrimination and a general assumption of the liberal notion of equality, going back to treating, like and differently. Okay, by the mid-1970s, it became apparent that simply including women in what one might now call gender-neutral human rights treaties, i.e. treaties that apply to everybody without any specification between women and men, was not working. That inequality between women and men was embedded, was part of every state, part of every sort of social grouping that one comes across, and that there needed to be a more specific women convention, so women specific, rather than just everyone is entitled to the enjoyment of all rights without distinction, etc. So throughout the 1970s, there is essentially a drafting process by the Commission on the Status of Women to have a women-specific convention. And the women-specific convention that you may have come across already is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women of 1979. Now, the Women's Convention, as it's usually called, takes as its model largely the Race Convention. Now, the Race Convention had already been adopted in 1965, so this is what, some 14 years later, and in many ways there is a symmetry between the Women's Convention and the Race Convention. But, and this is something we'll come back to with LGBT rights, you cannot assume that the bases for discrimination on the basis of race and the bases of discrimination on the basis of sex are the same. A very obvious example is that by and large, discrimination with respect to race comes from the other group. Yeah. Don't forget that in the early days of the UN, when the Race Convention was first adopted, it was not a racial minority convention. It was just any discrimination on the basis of race. The impetus behind the Race Convention was apartheid South Africa. And there, of course, it's the white minority discriminating against the black majority. We always tend to think about racial discrimination in terms of discrimination against the minority, but its historical origins were exactly the opposite. It's against the black majority. But essentially, with race discrimination, there is this division within society on the basis of race, where you've got one group discriminating against another. And by and large, obviously there are always exceptions, the discrimination is not occurring within the group itself. Yeah? Whereas with gender discrimination, where much of the harm of discrimination occurs is within the family. For example, it's not necessarily an outside group and an inside group, it is from family-based discrimination, family-based power structures, family-based assumptions about the role of women and the role of men. It's a very different setting straight away from the basic starting point of race discrimination. I would also add, just as a sort of footnote or an aside or whatever, that in 1965, when the Race Convention was adopted, this was the overwhelming policy of the General Assembly at the time. As decolonisation progresses, as particularly the countries that were colonised in Africa and Asia gained independence, they championed very strongly, as part of their newfound sovereignty, the elimination of racial discrimination in those countries where it still exists, i.e. at that point Southern Africa, not just South Africa, but also what's now Zimbabwe, and the Portuguese colonies. So there's a very strong political pressure within the General Assembly. There's never been the same political pressure with respect to gender discrimination. There's never been this absolutely overwhelming assumption that this is something that needs to be addressed. 1979, might also just point out, the year of the Women's Convention is also the year of the Iranian Revolution. and in many ways the commencement of the whole political processes that flow from that have been very adverse to women's discrimination against women. Anyway, we get the Women's Convention. What does the Women's Convention do? It defines discrimination. Although up until 1965 in the Race Convention, discrimination was prohibited, nobody ever defined it. And the Race Convention first defines discrimination, the Women's Convention uses the same definition, but pretty much, it's a couple of words differently. What is important is that by using the same definition, we now have really what's become an accepted international law definition of discrimination. And the international law definition of discrimination, importantly, 2 points about it. One, its purpose and effect. Okay, purpose is a passing of a policy or legislation or whatever that has the purpose of discriminating between women and men. Women are prohibited from entering into certain jobs, for example. That would be a direct, purposeful form of discrimination. Effect, often called indirect discrimination, is where there is a provision which is apparently neutral, but which has discriminatory impact. So, for example, nobody can apply for this particular job unless they're 6 feet tall. Yeah? Applies to everybody. Nothing discriminatory about it on its face. Who tends to be over 6 feet tall? Far fewer women than men. So that the effect is discriminatory, yeah, and therefore is prohibited by the convention. Another very common area of indirect discrimination is provisions relating, for example, to non-payment of benefits to part-time workers, who tends to create the part-time workforce, particularly within a society such as ourselves. It tends to be dominated by women. So it's an indirectly discriminatory type provision. So definition of discrimination including purpose and effect. The other important point about the definition of discrimination is that it is only adverse discrimination that is condemned. The debates that we get in many societies about positive discrimination, in other words, can you discriminate in favour of a particular group to redress a past differentiation, under the Women's Convention and the Race Convention does not apply. They both have the definition that is to condemn and eliminate discrimination where it impacts adversely upon the enjoyment of the rights in the Convention, adverse discrimination. And in fact, the Women's Convention includes specifically a provision that allows for what they call temporary special measures to redress past discriminations. So, for example, under the Women's Convention, it would be perfectly allowable to have a policy that deliberately allowed for favouring women applicants for a job, for example, if that is to redress the fact that historically there are very few women in a particular position. So temporary special measures, huge debates about whether or not temporary special measures are in fact justified, because often the argument is that this may involve discriminating against a particular individual man, say somebody who's applied for a job and who finds that he doesn't get it because it's being given to a woman, and there's usually all sorts of protections around it, sort of equally qualified, etc. But nevertheless, that one person is disadvantaged to redress a group wrong, yeah, against women in general. So it leads to a great deal of debate and contestation around that. But within the Convention, no argument. Temporary special measures are allowed. What else does the Convention do? It identifies those areas where discrimination is most marked and where it should therefore be specifically addressed. Public life, participation in public life, participation in education facilities at all levels, access to healthcare services, employment rights including equal pay, etc. So economic and social rights and civil and political rights, at the time again quite revolutionary, and also public life and private life. I've already said that the basis of adverse discrimination, which impacts strongly on women's lives, often commences in the family. Therefore, unlike other conventions, Article 16 focused specifically on equality between women and men in family relations, for entering into family relations, for enjoyment during family relations, and dissolution of family relations. But we might notice, given that we're coming on to LGBT rights, a very traditional concept of the family. A family that very much looks like man, woman, and children, you know, coming from the union of that man and woman. This is 1979, as you said at the very beginning, you know, the whole notion of either gender or anything relating to sexuality, sexual identity, gender identity is off the agenda. So it's probably hard now. I mean, this is what now, 25 years later? It's probably hard to realise that this was, at its time, revolutionary. You know, putting women into an international treaty and creating obligations for states to condemn and eliminate discrimination through their legislation, through their courts and tribunals, through their policies, through their practices. You know, it's all quite amazing stuff. The real tragedy is that, it's no longer seen as revolutionary, but it hasn't actually happened. You know, that's the way we go. The other important point about the Women's Convention is that there is also a provision requiring states to eliminate cultural and social stereotypes and prejudices that work to establish the inferiority of one sex for the other. Okay, how do you change a stereotype? Any thoughts? And just think of assumptions about the role of men and women that are based upon stereotypes. Women are passive, are quieter, are peace-loving, are, what else are we?
I don't know if we deal with drugs is because we have some man behind us. I discovered, I was in Brazil in a prison of women, and I asked the question, is this some gang? Apparently, all the big dealers now are women.
Yeah.
So it's not that they are asked by a man to do it. They are the boss. But we don't have.
But we have these stereotypes. Yeah. But even, how often do you hear, even where a woman is in some sort of leadership role, that she must in fact be being directed by some man to actually do it? How often do we judge women by what they're wearing, what their hairdo? I'm sure I look a mess. What their hairdo is. If a woman walks down the street, late at night, wearing fairly brief clothes, gets sexually abused, how often will you hear, well, she was obviously, a slut or a tart or was asking for it? Yeah, I mean, stereotypes around the place of women, where they are, how they're behaving, how they are dressed, all of those sorts of assumptions, which are of themselves a form of discrimination, and of themselves lead to denial of multiple other human rights. Yeah, again, you're all far too young to remember, but some years ago, there was a major ongoing in the press, the number of deaths of the Yorkshire Ripper. Yeah, the Yorkshire Ripper, the women who were being killed, bodies were being found, and so on. Most of the women, up to a certain point, were prostitutes. Then a woman was found dead that they assumed was, and it turned out it was by the same person, who was not a prostitute. You get the police in charge of the investigation saying, oh, this is now serious. Sort of real women or good women are now also in danger. Okay, based totally on a stereotype assumption about good women and bad women. Good mothers, bad mothers. Yeah? The Cedaw Convention requires states to take account of such stereotypes and to work to modify them. Now, two aspects. I've already said, how do you do that? You might want to sort of think about that. The other problem is, of course, that in addressing such stereotypes, you have to take on the media, you have to take on family relations, you have to take on the educational establishment, you have to take on the advertising industry type establishment, you have to take on those who will not accept any restriction at all on the freedom of speech. You know, there are major confrontations involved in the idea of addressing stereotypes, but at the same time, if stereotypes that are adverse and work against the enjoyment of human rights are not addressed, then equality really doesn't actually start meaning anything very much at all. And I think this is something that really comes up again with LGBT rights very strongly. Yeah, stereotypes around sexual identity. Stereotype about, well, you know, gays are going to be hairdressers, or, you know, sorry?
Pedophilia.
Absolutely, yeah, as a pure stereotype.
The Holy See never makes a statement about gay rights without dropping the word pedophilia
straight
somewhere
in
in the middle. Yeah.
Pure prejudice, pure stereotype are based upon absolutely no empirical or other evidence whatsoever. And I think this really is at the heart of both women's rights and LGBT rights. Okay, just another couple of points about the CEDAW Convention. 187 states parties as of today. It's the second most widely ratified human rights convention in the whole panoply of human rights conventions. Who's out of it? The United States and Iran, as I said. You know, these are strong bedfellows, for want of a better word. Sudan and South Sudan, couple of the Pacific Islands, that's pretty much it. Otherwise, it is universally ratified. It's interesting that it is so widely ratified, and yet then so often you get the argument that insisting upon women's equality is an imperialist cultural determination that doesn't fit with the cultural mores of many other societies. One has to ask, why have these other states entered into the Women's Convention? You don't have to do so if they do not accept the principles of the Convention. There's also a big issue about reservations to the Convention, but again, I think we won't go into the reservations aspect. Okay, this was 1979. And I think there was a sort of assumption at that point that, okay, we've dealt with women. We've now got the convention, women's human rights are settled, no problem. However, notice that the Women's Convention is not a women's rights convention. Nobody started from the point that says, what rights do women need to be able to enjoy, on the basis of equality with men, full guarantees of the whole panoply of rights. The starting point was where are women discriminated against in comparison with men. And so the assumption always remained that here is men, as the comparator. What is it about women that needs to be addressed to be able to have women looking equal with men? Yeah. So the starting point are male assumptions, male understandings of human rights. Okay, mid-80s, I'll jump again. By the mid-80s, we have this run of women's conferences. First conference was in the UN Decade for Women. They had a year for women, first of all, 1975, and everything to do with women was going to be resolved in a year. Then it didn't quite work like that, so they had a decade. They had 10 years, maybe we'll sort it out. So we get 1975, the Mexico conference, 1980, the mid-term conference, and the Women's Convention was in fact negotiated and drafted to be a big sort of celebration in the middle of the decade. We wanted something to show for it, so we have the Women's Convention, 1979, ready for the Copenhagen Conference in 1980. Nairobi in 1985 was, I think, really significant in many ways, not least because it brought together, really for the first time, far more than Mexico in 1975, women from the south and women from the north. It was now 6 years after the adoption of the CEDAW Convention, and the inadequacies of the CEDAW Convention were becoming far more evident. It led, you've had the sort of wave of feminism that's been taking place in the West, and a great deal of assertion, consideration, debate around why is it that the Women's Convention itself is really not adequate to ensure women's human rights. And following on from the Nairobi conference, we move in the 90s to the Vienna Conference on Human Rights itself, and then the Women's Conference in Beijing. Vienna Conference is 1993, the Beijing Conference is 1995, to this slogan, women's rights are human rights. And that's a real shift in language from elimination of discrimination to women's rights and human rights. What was meant by women's rights and human rights? What was meant was, how should we interpret universal human rights to ensure to women the same guarantee of equality of choice, equality of freedom of behaviour as men enjoy? So it's not just a matter of saying we must treat the two, men and women, equally. It's a matter of saying, let's identify what are the obstacles to the enjoyment of women's rights and what needs to be done to address those. And the big obstacle that was identified and which was addressed throughout the 1980s was violence. Violence against women. And this is really where we get the Violence Against Women campaign becoming very strongly the focus of the women's human rights. The slogan at Vienna was women's rights are human rights, women's rights are and I can never remember all the words, an integral, indivisible, what's the other word?
Interdependent?
Independent, no, integrated, independent. Anyway, women's rights are part of human rights. But what we also get at Vienna is the recognition that violence against women is the major obstacle to the enjoyment of rights and is of itself a violation of human rights. Now, how did we actually get here? And then we link on to gender, and then I'll hand over to you. How we got there was, I've already just said, that the assumption in the Universal Human Rights Treaties and then the Women-Specific Treaty is an assumption that here is the catalogue of human rights, provided women are not discriminated with respect to the enjoyment of those rights, all will be fine. Take the right to life. Right to life obviously applies to women and men, yeah? Applies to everybody, absolutely gender neutral right. What does the ICCPR say about the right to life? What it essentially says is nobody shall be deprived arbitrarily of their life. Now, the ICCPR, as all human rights conventions, is essentially a convention about the relationship between the state and the individual. So what it means is nobody shall be arbitrarily deprived of their life by the state, yeah? And so if a woman is taken out and shot without any form of trial, summary execution by the state, then clearly she has the same right to life, and that's a violation of her right to life in exactly the same way as it would be if a man is taken out and summarily executed. But that's not the way in which women are most likely to be arbitrarily deprived of their life. How are women more likely to be arbitrarily deprived of their life? Through domestic violence, through rape, sexual violence, etc., by most commonly members of their own community or members of their own family. Stranger rape and sexual violence, apart from the context of warfare, is essentially the exception, not the norm. Through having to go and find a backstreet abortion because there is no way of having a legal abortion and therefore dying as a consequence of it. Through so-called honour killings. Back to stereotypes. What's the stereotype? That a woman is virtuous, pure, that any defiance of her part relating to that sort of image is in fact bringing shame upon the family, and therefore it is justified in killing her. In 4 forcing young girls into marriage at an age when their bodies are not able to accommodate sexual intercourse, and therefore causing death through either pregnancy when they're too young to do so, or through other forms of internal injury, and so on. Multiple ways. And I say this is what's really at Nairobi in 1985, as women came together. All these forms of violence had really previously been understood as private, individual, nothing to do with the relationship between the state and the individual. What beginning to present data on the commonality of manifestations of violence against women because they are women. That is the absolute crucial point. What that did is indicate that this is structural. It's about subordination, it's about women's place in society, it's about the failure of the state to ensure the guarantee of rights to women. And so through the 1980s, this notion of violence against women as a human rights issue, as central to the relationship of the state to women, became gradually accepted first at Vienna, followed up in Beijing, also accepted through the General Assembly resolution on the elimination of violence against women, and essentially around 2 or 3 core principles. The state has the obligation to exercise due diligence to prevent, protect, prosecute, punish perpetrators of violence against women. Okay? And that is a positive obligation on the state with respect to behaviours within the private sector. Again, you can see how confrontational that is. It's saying the state can and must become involved in familial relationships relating to the protection of protection of women against these various forms of violence. Okay, but what also starts coming in now then is, well, what is this definition of violence against women? You as a woman, can go walk down the street tonight. You might get mugged by somebody who wants your telephone. Yeah, it may or may not be because you're a woman. Yeah, it may be that you're walking along with a group of men and women and you all get attacked. That is not necessarily violence against women. The Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, that's the monitoring committee of the CEDAW Convention, provided the definition that said that gender-based violence is violence that is disproportionate, exclusively or disproportionately directed at a woman because she is a woman. So, for example, the violence relating to, let's say, a forced abortion, one-child policy, forced abortion of a woman who then becomes pregnant again. That is directed at her because she is a woman. Yeah? An honour killing, in inverted commas, is directed because she is perceived to have broken social mores relating to the behaviour of women. It's behaviour that is directed at her because of being a woman. And so what we now get coming into the language is this construction of the notion of gender as well as sex. Because not all of these forms of violence are because of sex. They are because of social constructions around how a woman should behave. And because of social constructions around how a woman should behave, then we have to differentiate between biological sex and social constructions of gender. And social constructions of gender are what leads in many situations to the vulnerability to certain forms of violence. Now notice also, social constructions of gender lead straight back to the stereotypes, that we were talking about a moment ago. Social constructions of gender depend upon where you are. I suspect women who are in this room have different understandings of their position as women as a gender from women who live in rural Mali, for example, or in, I don't know, wherever. Social constructions depend upon the social environment in which you live. And they are constructed and supported by those social structures, and also lead to notions of power and hierarchy. Yeah? As soon as you start differentiating on the basis of social construction, you end up in a social power type structure. Okay, so where do we get to? We've got Women's Convention, which talks only about sex. We get the focus on violence against women, but through violence against women we get the understanding of gender coming in. And notice, of course, men also can suffer from gender-based forms of violence. Yeah? Gender is relational. It's relational between women and men. So I get very fed up with it over and over again. You hear that women are the greatest victims of armed conflict, for example. Women are the victims of certain gender-based forms of harm in armed conflict. So they are victims of, most commonly, sexual violence, rape, etc. in armed conflict. Men tend to be the soldier out there who are getting killed. You know, look at Srebrenica. What happened at Srebrenica? The women and men were divided. The women were detained in horrific situations. Many of them were subjected to rape while they were detained. Then eventually they were put in buses and taken away. The men were taken away and killed. Why were they killed? They were killed because they were deemed to be of fighting age, and therefore might, therefore fight against the other side. That is a gender-based harm. So I think we need to be very careful when we're talking about gender-based harms, because the movement came through the focus on violence against women. We tend to think about it as being only women who have gender-based harms. It works both ways. But, of course, once one has the notion of gender as opposed to purely biological sex, now, biological sex still, of course, continues in many ways to impact upon women's enjoyments of human rights. And I've mentioned abortion a couple of times. That's biological, yeah? But once we have the idea of social constructions and gender, the next argument that comes in is, well, why are we limiting it only to women and men? And this is the way in which, increasingly towards the 90s, the idea of rights-based, guarantees of rights regardless of, I'm still putting it wrongly, the guarantees of rights which are needed to ensure the enjoyment of all human rights of those of sexual minorities, transgender identities and so on, starts coming in. The word gender was unbelievably contested internationally, precisely because it was seen as a peg through which sexual identity and gender identity can start coming into the human rights movement. Now, just to finish, and then, because I'm probably talking too much, but just to finish on this sort of story, this chronology, and how the two are all coming together. Well, the three are coming, the violence, the human rights, and now gender are all coming together. Let's jump to the international criminal law framework. 1990s, exactly as Vienna is going place. Vienna World Human Rights Conference, where the human rights of women are asserted to be an integral part of human rights. And while violence against women is recognised as being a violation of women's human rights, the war in Bosnia is going on. The war in Bosnia is characterised by extreme violence, and including violence against women, sexual violence, gender-based violence. We already talked about Srebrenica. The Security Council response, as I presume you all know, was the creation of the ICTY. And women's movement at that point was instrumental in demanding that the jurisdiction of the ICTY included rape and sexual violence. Now, it was no bag game. It sounds obvious now, but at the time, I mean, I can remember standing up giving talks, arguing for all of this, and being told you could never, ever have a charge of rape in an international criminal tribunal. Just can't do it. You know, where on earth are you going to get the evidence from? Where on earth are you ever going to get women to come and testify about it? Oh, it happens all the time anyway. It's a standard aspect of war. What on earth do you want to do trying to make it a particular crime within the jurisdiction of the court? Okay, we semi-won at the ICTY. By the ICTR, we win a bit more, but the language of the statutes changes. The real battle comes at Rome, ICC. Rome is unlike Security Council resolutions creating the ICTY and the ICTR, the statute for the Rome ICC, the Rome statute for the ICC, is a treaty, and a treaty is negotiated. And so at Rome you get all 190 whatever states it was, and a huge contingent of NGOs, civil society, all arguing for different points to get into. Ever read the Rome statute at any point? Anyway, sort of all the absolutely huge numbers of issues related to criminal law, criminal administration, etc., etc. Anyway, the women's lobby were absolutely insistent and were successful in getting the inclusion of rape, enforced prostitution, forced sterilisation, and a number of other crimes included as a war crime, as a crime against humanity, and this is where the real crunch came, gender-based persecution as a crime against humanity. Now, backtrack again. At Nuremberg, the crime of genocide didn't exist, prior to the Genocide Convention in 1948. So Nuremberg, which is the war crimes in the Tribunal of Far East, don't have any charges of genocide. So the targeting of particular groups, obviously the Jews in particular, through the Holocaust, was dealt with as persecution as a crime against humanity. Targeting a particular group as a crime against humanity. At Nuremberg, a crime against humanity was targeting, persecuting on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, not gender. The fight at Rome was to get included gender-based persecution, persecution of people on the basis of gender. Why was this so controversial? Because it was thought that if you allowed persecution on the basis of gender in as a crime against humanity, that would encompass persecution of homosexuals, gays, transgender, etc. And this was fought tooth and nail all the way down the line. Now just think about it a moment. We're not talking about gay rights. We're talking about creating as a crime against humanity persecution of people on the basis of their sex or gender identity. Remember that homosexuals were also one of the major targets in Nazi Germany, one of the major groups who were targeted. At Rome, again, this unholy alliance, the Holy See, Iran, a number of other countries, were completely rejecting the notion of including gender-based persecution. And the compromise at the end was that it was included, but gender was defined as the two sexes, man and women. In other words, let's define gender as sex. But then you do have this catch-all phrase. This is what happens with negotiations of the treaty. You fight and fight and fight over certain words, and everybody gets exhausted, and you can get something in that you didn't expect to get in. So gender is defined in the Rome Statute as men and women, and comprising men and women in the context of society. Which, yes, right, which does allow, although it was not intended, to get back into gender. And really that becomes a very important peg, I think, for then leading on to a much more nuanced and much more full-on discussion of the notion of LGBT rights. The other huge fight at Rome was forced pregnancy. What's the crime of forced pregnancy? What are the two elements of it? What makes a crime of forced pregnancy? Rape, being made pregnant, and what's the second element?
Not being allowed to do abortion.
Yeah, not being allowed to have an abortion. So if you have a crime of forced pregnancy, what are you saying? That there should be a right to have an abortion. Yeah? So again, hugely controversial as to whether or not that should be accepted. And as with another story, that is the beginning of what is becoming slightly more accepted with respect to reproductive rights. Should we have a bit of discussion, or
yeah,
any comments?
Yeah, we can have 5 minutes, and I think then we break for the coffee.
And
then I do
you do
25 minutes,
yeah,
and then we open for a general discussion.
Yeah,
we keep it.
Yeah. So comments, questions. Why is it so difficult? Can I ask something? Yeah, I was going to ask there. Why is it so difficult to get these notions accepted? Go on, you ask.
If you had to pick one big question at the moment, that would be the question, that the most pressing women's rights question at UN level and at UK level. Will they be the same, and what will they be?
Is it at UN level and UK level, or is it between Western women? I mean, 'cause the biggest issue, I think, for women worldwide is probably poverty and the feminisation of poverty. And the feminisation of poverty, of course, feeds into and makes women vulnerable to particularly violence, particularly to being unable to escape from abusive relationships, from becoming subjected to trafficking, other forms of exploitation, the interrelationship between poverty, ethnic identity and conflict is very strong. So all of those. So if you say women worldwide, I'd say poverty is the way to one. Well, what's highest on the agenda, UN and UK? Well, I think in the UK it should be precisely that, austerity. What is austerity doing? And how is austerity and austerity policies differentiating and impacting differentially between women and men? And women's association with the state is very frequently through the welfare services, whether it's through taking children to school, becoming involved in schooling type issues, health services, particularly through maternity, pregnancy, etc., housing type issues, services following on from divorce, etc., etc. So cutbacks on welfare benefits have, and I think just nowhere near considered enough, major gender issues. So I think here that should be far and away number one. I was reading, before I came out, the UK reported to the CEDAW committee July 2013, just has done so, and included in the committee's comment are precisely that, the whole issue of impact of austerity. The Fawcett Society tried to commence a case before the High Court in this country. Fawcett Society is one of the main, long-established women's groups, precisely challenging one of Osborne's budgets, precisely on its gender discriminatory impact. High Court threw it out. So it never got very far. So that would, I think, would be, at the UN level, I don't know, UN level, armed conflict. I mean, the big, having said that about austerity, William Hague, of course, is running at the moment this prevention of sexual violence in armed conflict initiative, and he's making that the number one foreign policy issue. So, depending whether you, I was about to say talking to Osborne, I don't suppose Osborne somehow would put gender and austerity high on his agenda. We're talking about Osborne. William Hague, as the foreign side, would clearly say the prevention of sexual violence and armed conflict initiative. Internationally, violence against women is still very high on the agenda. The Women, Peace and Security agenda before the Security Council. Yep. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah. What's the problem of the state signing and then ratifying the treaties and conventions, but then they don't apply that in domestic law or promote it, and then make people aware that it exists.
Yeah, you tell me. I mean, I don't know the answer to it. I don't know why governments do these things. I can think of various reasons. Just by the way, of course, the UK has not incorporated the CEDAW Convention into domestic law. You know, we will go on, and the government goes on about the Human Rights Act. That's actually the very limited European Convention on Human Rights. It's certainly not the Women's Convention. To look like a good international citizen. Quite often, policies, say from the EU and so on, you know, conditionality, where states have to show a commitment to women's human rights to be able to get development aid or whatever it may be. Signing a treaty, ratifying a treaty, looks like a good way of doing that, without going too much further. I also think that they actually don't think it's particularly important. You know, it's something that they can do, that nobody... The point I made at the beginning, women's human rights are not high on the agenda of any one state. So therefore, if a state becomes a party to the Women's Convention and openly violates it, the chances are nobody's actually going to take it up and have adverse consequences for them. Since there are no adverse consequences, why not do it? You know, you can look good. Can you think of any other reasons? I mean, I'm sure there are a host of other sort of reasons, but I suspect those are...
I think because everybody else is saying it,
Yeah.
so why not us?
Yeah, because let's look like a good member of the international community. Yeah. But it's very frustrating.
I mean, you were talking about norms and value setting, and for me, one of the big issues in the UK certainly is around the way in which new media frames and perpetuates the stereotypes about women and girls, and particularly for the new generations of young people coming through. And I wondered if there's any overlay between human rights frameworks and the public duties within them, and any traction for challenging the media empire, music, businesses and so on, or because they're not state institutions, do they really not map across in a neat way?
They should, because of the requirements that I've already said of Article 5, you know, of addressing cultural stereotypes and practices that lead to the superiority of one sex or the other. In practice, no, for all sorts of reasons. I mean, again, to give an example, when the Levinson report was, the Levinson inquiry was going on, women's groups made quite a strong representation to Levinson. He takes up precisely this point and includes it as, well, if you're looking at the media overall, let's include it directly. It hasn't had any traction, really, since then. It does get mentioned in the Levinson report, but it hasn't been, well, very little of the Levinson report's been taken up anyway, but that certainly, hasn't been taken up. And of course, as I said earlier, it runs not only into the sort of entrenched of big business, but it runs into other human rights, interference with freedom of speech, interference with property rights, it could well be argued. So yes, I think you can make the argument. What it really comes down to is human rights the effective discourse to actually challenge these things? Yeah.
I just wanted to come in on that point because there were recommendations in the last examinations on both CERD and CEDAW in relation to that point.
Exactly.
And the state's response was to, in the first instance, defer to Ofcom and say we do have a regulatory mechanism in place, but also to use the freedom of speech arguments as to why they weren't going to push Ofcom to move further. But since then, looking at other mechanisms, it does seem that the public sector equality duty is actually a more powerful mechanism to encourage change and promote equality between different groups than actually using the human rights.
Well, exactly. The equality framework itself, of course, is a human rights concept and should be more firmly, I think, put into that language of human rights obligation. Take back simple. I didn't realise you said CERD did it as well. I knew that CEDAW
yeah, particularly in relation as well. To Gypsy and Travellers.
Oh, of course, yes. Yeah. And the other committee that could well get onto, of course, is the Children's Committee. It's a major issue with respect to younger people on exactly these matters.
My question relates to both previous questions. How do we redefine this social construction of gender in regards to education, media, how would we redefine it? It's quite a tough one.
I was going to say, shall we leave it? Shall we leave it? She says, ducking it carefully. We're going to have a break. Shall we leave it to the sort of general discussion at the end? I mean, other people have probably got good answers to that as I have. I mean, if we knew how to do that, it would be a long, long way. But anyway, yeah, shall we take a break?
Yeah, we take a break. I don't know.
I think that's the question we have to give.
We all get the coffee and we come back in 10 minutes.
Where do we get coffees?
I think it's there.
Oh, correct.
Cold drinks, I'm afraid, but yeah.
Cold drinks. Okay. So cold drinks, no coffee.
You're right.
That's cruelty in January.